The grand ballroom was filled with glimmering lights, sparkling chandeliers, and the soft hum of conversations blending with the elegant clinking of champagne glasses. The guests, dressed in their finest gowns and sharp tuxedos, laughed and chatted, moving gracefully from one group to the next. The atmosphere was lively, almost magical, as the annual charity gala hosted by one of the most influential billionaires in the city was in full swing. Amidst all the glamour, a young woman, dressed modestly in a simple but elegant black dress, stood quietly near the entrance observing the event. She wasn't a part of the glittering crowd. She was there because of her job, helping out with the event as a volunteer. Her task was simple: assist with anything the organizers needed, guide guests to their tables, and make sure everything ran smoothly. But tonight something was bothering her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As she walked through the crowd, ensuring everything was in place, her eyes kept drifting toward a small figure sitting by the corner of the room. A little girl, no older than 8 or 9, sat alone at a table near the back. The girl was small and delicate, with long brown hair that cascaded down her back. She wore a beautiful dress that sparkled, almost matching the rest of the opulence in the room. But despite the glittering surroundings, the little girl seemed out of place. The young woman couldn't help but notice that no one was speaking to the girl. People walked past her without so much as a glance, caught up in their own conversations and festivities. The girl sat still, her hands resting neatly on her lap, her eyes cast downwards as if she was lost in thought. But what truly struck the young woman was the silence around the girl. The little one didn't speak. Curious and concerned, the young woman approached one of the waiters nearby and asked, "Who is she? Why is she sitting alone?" The waiter, a man in his late 20s, glanced over at the little girl and then back at the woman with a shrug. "That's Ava," he said quietly. "She's the daughter of the host, but no one talks to her. She's different." The woman frowned, confused. "Different? How?" The waiter hesitated for a moment before replying in a low voice. "She's deaf. She can't hear. Most of the people here don't know how to communicate with her, so they just ignore her. Even her father doesn't really know how to connect with her." The young woman's heart sank. She glanced back at the little girl who was still sitting quietly at her table. There were so many people around her, yet she was alone in a room full of noise, surrounded by laughter and music, but isolated by her silence. The young woman could see the frustration in the girl's eyes, but it was not anger. It was the quiet sadness of someone who had been left out again and again. The young woman, who had grown up in a family that valued kindness and empathy, couldn't help but feel that something needed to be done. But what? She didn't know sign language, and it didn't seem like anyone else did either. How could she help someone who couldn't hear? As the night went on, the young woman's mind kept drifting back to the little girl. Every time she walked by the table, Ava's quiet, still presence tugged at her heart. She noticed how no one else paid attention to her, how no one even seemed to acknowledge that she existed, except for an occasional fleeting glance from her father, who stood nearby talking to other wealthy guests. The young woman's mind raced with questions. Why did Ava's father seem so distant? Was he ashamed of his daughter? The thought made her uneasy, but she couldn't judge him too harshly. The world often treated people with disabilities as if they were invisible. It wasn't that people didn't care. It was simply that they didn't know how to care. As the evening continued, the young woman found herself growing more and more uncomfortable. It wasn't just Ava's isolation that bothered her. It was the sense of helplessness that she could feel growing inside of her. She wanted to do something, but what could she do? She was just a volunteer at a fancy party. She had no special skills, no experience with sign language or working with children who had disabilities. She was just an observer, a bystander to someone else's pain. But as the night wore on, the feeling of helplessness started to shift. The young woman knew she couldn't sit by and do nothing. Ava needed someone to notice her, someone to acknowledge her presence. It was a small thing, but it was a start. She decided that she would at least go over to the little girl and try to make her feel seen. With a deep breath, the young woman walked over to Ava's table. She smiled warmly at the little girl, who looked up at her but didn't say anything. The girl's expression was soft, almost cautious, as if she wasn't sure if this stranger would ignore her like the others. The young woman didn't know what to say. She had never interacted with a deaf child before, but she smiled, hoping that a friendly gesture would be enough to bridge the gap. "Hi," the young woman said softly. "I'm here to keep you company for a bit." Ava didn't respond with words, but she did raise her eyebrows slightly, as if surprised by the attention. The young woman sat down beside her, still unsure of what to do next. She felt awkward and out of place, but she didn't want to leave. The minutes passed slowly, but the young woman stayed with Ava. She didn't know how to communicate with her, but she could tell that the little girl appreciated her presence. Ava's eyes softened and she gave the young woman a small, shy smile. That was enough for the young woman to feel that she was doing the right thing. But as much as Ava appreciated the kindness, the young woman knew that there was more she could do. She could tell that Ava wanted to be part of the crowd, to engage with others, but she didn't know how. The young woman couldn't help but wonder if anyone had ever really tried to get to know her. Ava had a lot to offer, she was sure of that. But in a world that only valued what it could hear, Ava had been left behind. For the rest of the evening, the young woman stayed with Ava, keeping her company when no one else did. She watched the little girl's face brighten when the young woman smiled at her, and the sadness that had been there earlier seemed to fade, even if just for a moment. She knew that this small act of kindness wasn't going to change everything. It wasn't going to make the world more accepting of people with disabilities, or suddenly erase the communication barriers that made Ava's life so difficult. But for that evening, for those few hours, the young woman was determined to make sure Ava didn't feel invisible. And as the night came to a close and the guests began to leave, the young woman found herself wishing that more people could see what she had seen. A little girl who was not defined by her silence, but by the quiet strength in her eyes. The evening continued to unfold with the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversations around the young woman and Ava. The young woman sat beside Ava at the corner table, unsure of what to say next but determined to stay by her side. Ava had not spoken a word, but her presence was more than enough. The young woman smiled at her again, hoping that somehow just by being there she could make the little girl feel a little less alone. As time passed, the guests around them seemed to fade into the background. The young woman couldn't help but notice how Ava seemed so serene in the middle of the bustling crowd. There were flashes of laughter and music around them, but Ava was quiet, content to watch the world from her seat. Every so often, the young woman would glance around at the guests and wonder if anyone noticed Ava's isolation, or if they were too caught up in their own lives to care. Ava's father, the billionaire, stood not far from the table, surrounded by a group of influential people all deep in conversation. The young woman had seen him a few times throughout the evening, always smiling, always shaking hands, but never once approaching his daughter. It was as if he didn't even notice her sitting quietly in the corner. It struck the young woman as odd, especially for someone who had so much wealth and influence. How could he not see her? How could he not care? The young woman didn't want to judge, but she couldn't help but wonder if Ava's father was too focused on his own world to see the one right in front of him. He was a man used to being admired, a man who commanded attention wherever he went, but in his own home, his own child seemed to be invisible. The more the young woman thought about it, the more a sense of unease settled in her chest. She had worked with children in the past, though never a child with a disability, and had seen how important it was for parents to engage with their children. The connection they shared wasn't just about spending time together. It was about being present, about really seeing one another. It was about making sure a child knew they mattered, even when the world around them didn't seem to notice. But as the night wore on, the young woman realized that Ava's father wasn't the only one who seemed to be missing something. The other guests, too, appeared to be so wrapped up in their own lives that they overlooked the quiet, unnoticed girl sitting just a few feet away. Some of them, the young woman thought, probably didn't even realize she was there at all. It wasn't out of malice, but more out of ignorance. People had grown so accustomed to being surrounded by noise, by words, that they had forgotten what it meant to communicate without them. Feeling a deep sense of empathy for the little girl, the young woman resolved that she couldn't just sit there. She couldn't continue. Watching as Ava sat alone in a room full of people who didn't understand her. The young woman had seen enough. She had worked with children in the past, and while she wasn't an expert in sign language, she had picked up a few basic signs through her work. She knew enough to communicate a little, to make someone feel seen, to offer the kind of connection that Ava so desperately needed. But even as she made up her mind, the young woman hesitated. She had never been in this kind of situation before, What if she made a mistake? What if Ava couldn't understand her? Or worse, what if she offended her? There were so many questions swirling in her mind. But the thought of leaving Ava alone in that corner, unseen and unheard, was unbearable. Taking a deep breath, the young woman turned to Ava and gently touched her arm. Ava looked up, her dark eyes meeting the young woman's gaze. For a moment, the young woman was unsure of how to proceed. She had learned a few basic signs over the years, but she wasn't fluent. Still, she knew she had to try. She smiled softly and signed, "Hi, how are you?" Ava's eyes widened, surprised. She seemed to take a moment to process the signs, and then, for the first time that evening, her lips curved into a small, shy smile. The young woman felt a rush of relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. Ava had understood her. The young woman smiled back, her heart swelling with warmth. "My name is Rachel. What's yours?" Ava paused for a second before signing her name. "Ava," she signed, her small fingers moving delicately through the air. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. There was something so beautiful in the simplicity of their exchange. They weren't just speaking through words. They were speaking through a language of understanding, of connection. And for the first time that evening, Rachel felt like she was truly reaching Ava. As the conversation continued, Rachel learned that Ava was not only deaf, but also struggled with the isolation that came with it. She couldn't communicate easily with others, and many people didn't know how to engage with her. Rachel realized that while Ava's father had provided for all of her material needs, he had never truly been able to connect with her on a personal level. He was a man of great power, a man who had built an empire from the ground up. But when it came to his daughter, he seemed helpless. Rachel asked Ava what she liked to do, and Ava's face lit up when she signed that she loved to draw. She quickly pulled out a small notebook from her bag and began sketching a picture of a butterfly, her hands moving gracefully across the page. Rachel leaned in to watch, fascinated by the fluidity of Ava's movements. The drawing was beautiful, delicate, yet full of life. It was clear that Ava had a gift for creating, a gift that went unnoticed by most. For the next few hours, Rachel stayed with Ava, quietly communicating with her in the limited sign language she knew. The more they spoke, the more Rachel realized how much Ava had to say, even though she couldn't use her voice. Her smile grew brighter. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as they shared stories through their hands. Ava had so much to offer, and for the first time that evening, Rachel felt that she was able to connect with her on a level that most people around them didn't seem to understand. But even as the night wore on, Rachel couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was missing. Ava's father, though he was still present in the room, hadn't once come over to check on his daughter. He was engaged in conversations with high-powered guests, shaking hands with other influential people. The young woman could see that he was focused on his business, on the world that he was building. It wasn't that he didn't care about his daughter. It was that he didn't know how to. Rachel's heart ached for Ava, who, despite being surrounded by luxury and wealth, was stuck in a world where no one understood her. And it wasn't just Ava who was trapped. It was her father, too. He had everything that money could buy, but he didn't have what mattered most, a connection with his own child. As Rachel sat there with Ava, she felt a deep sense of compassion for both of them. Ava needed more than just a room full of people. She needed a connection, a bridge between her world and the world of those who couldn't hear her. And her father, he needed to understand that his wealth and success didn't mean anything if he couldn't connect with the person who meant the most to him. But in that moment, as she sat beside Ava, Rachel felt that something was starting to shift. Maybe it wasn't the grand change that the world needed, but it was a beginning. Ava wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in a long time she felt seen. The night continued, and Rachel found herself lost in the small moments of connection she had with Ava. The soft light from the chandeliers above cast a warm glow over the table where they sat. For the first time that evening, Ava's presence didn't feel lonely. Rachel was there with her, listening and trying to understand in the best way she could. As Rachel watched Ava, she couldn't help but marvel at the small but significant changes she'd already seen in the little girl. Just hours ago, Ava had been sitting alone in silence, unnoticed by the crowd. Now she was engaged, smiling, and communicating through a language Rachel had learned, but never fully embraced before. With every sign, every smile, Ava seemed to open up more. It was a simple connection, but it felt like a bridge that hadn't existed before. Ava was more than just a quiet girl in the corner. She was a child with dreams, with a sense of wonder and curiosity. As she drew her butterfly, Rachel noticed how carefully she worked, each stroke of her pencil done with purpose. There was a quiet strength in the way Ava expressed herself, even though the world around her seemed to be moving too fast for her to catch up. Rachel looked around the room again, and for the first time she felt a deep sadness. The other guests were still caught up in their own lives, oblivious to the child in the corner. They couldn't see what Rachel saw, a young girl who had been overlooked, who had so much to say but no one to listen. As the evening wore on, Rachel felt more and more unsettled by the realization that, despite the wealth and success surrounding Ava, she had been neglected. It wasn't just a lack of attention, it was the absence of understanding. People didn't know how to communicate with Ava, so they avoided her. They didn't understand her, and in turn they didn't take the time to try. But it wasn't just the guests who were at fault. Ava's father, the billionaire who hosted the grand event, was no better. He had spent most of the night mingling with other influential people, his attention fully consumed by the business deals and high-profile conversations that seemed to matter more than the daughter sitting just a few feet away. The young woman had noticed him glancing in Ava's direction a few times, but he hadn't moved toward her, hadn't even given her the time of day. Rachel felt a pang of sympathy for the man. It wasn't that he didn't care about his daughter. It was that he didn't know how. His life had been built on wealth and power, on making deals and creating connections that benefited him and his business. But when it came to Ava, it was as if he was lost. He didn't know how to connect with her in a way that truly mattered. And from what Rachel could see, he wasn't the only one. The world had become so focused on noise, on constant communication through words. That silence, Ava's silence, had become something people didn't know how to handle. A few times, Rachel had caught Ava's father glancing at her with a look of sadness in his eyes, as if he too knew he had failed his daughter. But his failure wasn't intentional. It was the result of his inability to communicate with her, to understand her needs. He had built his empire with determination and hard work, but it seemed like he had forgotten the most important thing of all, the need for human connection. Rachel didn't know if Ava's father would ever realize what he was missing. But she knew one thing for sure: Ava needed him. She needed him to see her, to truly see her beyond her silence. She needed him to understand that communication wasn't just about words. It was about being present, being willing to meet someone where they were, and trying to connect on a deeper level. Rachel turned her attention back to Ava, who had finished her butterfly drawing and was now flipping through her sketchbook. Ava's face had softened, and for a moment Rachel could see the joy in her eyes. It was the kind of joy that came from doing something she loved, from creating something beautiful. Ava's talent was clear. Her drawings weren't just pictures. They were expressions of her thoughts, her feelings, her world. Rachel smiled and watched as Ava continued to sketch, the soft movement of her hands a quiet reminder of the world that so many people overlooked. Ava had something to say, something to show the world. But for so long it seemed like no one had been willing to listen. The young woman decided it was time to take a step further. If she could help Ava in some small way, if she could give her the gift of connection, then she would. She leaned in slightly and asked, "Would you like to show me more of your drawings?" Ava looked up at her and nodded, her eyes brightening. She eagerly flipped to a new page in her sketchbook and handed it to Rachel. It was another drawing, this time of a tree, its branches stretching outward like arms reaching for the sky. It was beautiful in its simplicity, yet it held a sense of depth that was hard to ignore. "Tell me about it," Rachel signed. Ava hesitated for a moment, as if thinking about how to explain, but then began to sign in a slow, deliberate way. Rachel watched, carefully trying to follow the signs. Ava's hands moved gracefully, and Rachel realized that Ava wasn't just telling her about a tree. She was telling her about a feeling, about a part of her world that was quiet and peaceful. Through the signs, Rachel understood that the tree represented Ava's hope. Hope that one day she could reach the people around her. Hope that she could find a way to make others understand. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a window into Ava's soul. Rachel felt a lump in her throat as she watched Ava's eyes light up while explaining her artwork. She could see the passion in Ava's gestures, the way her hands spoke with such clarity even without words. This was who Ava was. Not just a deaf girl sitting in a corner, but a creative, intelligent child, with a deep well of emotion and thoughts to share. As Rachel looked at the tree drawing, she realized how much Ava had to offer. She wasn't just a quiet child who had been left behind, she was a storyteller, an artist, someone who saw the world differently and expressed it in ways that others couldn't. For the next hour, Rachel and Ava continued to communicate, sharing stories through their hands. Rachel asked Ava about her other drawings, her favorite things, and her dreams. She learned that Ava loved nature and animals, that she found peace in the quiet moments of life. She loved to draw because it was a way for her to express herself when words failed her. Rachel found herself drawn into Ava's world. The more they shared, the more she realized how much she had in common with the little girl. She too had always loved to create, to express herself through writing and art. But Rachel had always taken her voice for granted. She had never had to face the kind of isolation Ava did every day. As the night drew to a close, Rachel felt a sense of sadness, but also a sense of hope. Ava had opened up to her in ways that she had never done with anyone else. The young woman knew that their connection wasn't going to change the world overnight, but it was a start. Ava wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time that evening, Rachel felt like she had made a difference in someone's life. As the guests began to leave, Rachel stood up and gently placed her hand on Ava's shoulder. "I'm glad I got to meet you," she signed. Ava smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. For the first time that night, she didn't look lonely. She didn't look invisible, and for that, Rachel was grateful. The following days after the gala were quiet, yet they left an impression that lingered long after the lights of the ballroom had dimmed. Rachel found herself thinking about Ava more than she anticipated. What had started as a simple act of kindness, sitting with a lonely child at a lavish event, had blossomed into something deeper. It wasn't just about the evening they spent together, but about the realization that Ava needed someone to understand her, someone to see her as more than just her silence. In the days that followed, Rachel kept wondering about Ava's father, the man who had everything, wealth, influence, power, yet it seemed had lost his way when it came to his daughter. He was a self-made billionaire, a man who had built an empire, who had earned the admiration of countless people in his field. But when it came to his own daughter, he was silent. In the midst of all the noise of his successful world, he had forgotten how to connect with the one person who mattered most. Rachel couldn't stop thinking about the moments she had witnessed at the gala, where the billionaire had looked toward his daughter, but never approached. He had that same look of sadness she had noticed earlier, but it was mixed with helplessness, as if he didn't know what to do, as if he didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. It wasn't a lack of love. Rachel could sense that he loved his daughter. But love, as Rachel knew, wasn't always enough. Love had to be followed by action. Love had to be shown in the smallest everyday moments. And in those moments, Ava had been invisible. Rachel wanted to help, but she wasn't sure how. She knew that a simple act of kindness had made a difference for Ava. But that wasn't enough. Ava needed more. She needed her father to see her, to hear her in a way that only he could. But how could Rachel help bring about that change? It was on one particularly quiet afternoon that Rachel received a call from the event organizers. It was unexpected, but they had a request. Ava's father had reached out to them. He wanted to meet with Rachel. Rachel felt a mix of surprise and curiosity. She hadn't expected the billionaire to reach out to her, but she realized that this was a chance she couldn't ignore. She agreed to meet him the following day. The meeting was set in a luxurious office, the kind of space that felt too polished, too perfect. But as Rachel walked in, she noticed something different. The billionaire, who had always seemed so composed and confident, now appeared tired, worn. There was a heaviness in his eyes that made him seem smaller than the towering figure he usually presented to the world. He stood up as she entered, his posture formal but his face soft with a quiet urgency. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low but sincere. Rachel nodded, unsure of what to expect. "Of course, I'm glad to be here." He gestured for her to sit, and they both settled into the large leather chairs in front of his desk. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts before speaking again. "I don't know where to start," he said with a sigh. "But I'll be honest. I've never known how to talk to my daughter. I've been too focused on everything else. I thought providing for her, giving her everything I could would be enough. But I've come to realize that it isn't. I've missed something important." Rachel listened quietly, sensing the vulnerability in his words. It wasn't the arrogance she had expected, but a raw honesty that revealed the inner conflict he had been carrying for years. I've seen how she reacts when people speak to her, when they ignore her. She's so quiet, so still, and I can't tell if she's okay, if she feels like she belongs. I'm failing her, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Rachel felt her heart soften. She had been right. He didn't want to fail his daughter. He simply didn't know how to reach her. His wealth and power had been his strength in every other area of life, but when it came to Ava, those things didn't matter. I'm not asking you to fix everything, Rachel. I know it's not that simple, he continued, but I need help. I need to understand her better. I need to learn how to communicate with her, how to be there for her in a way that matters. Rachel took a moment to process his words. She could see the desperation in his eyes, but also a glimmer of hope. He wanted to change. He wanted to do right by his daughter, and that was a powerful first step. I think the first step is recognizing that Ava's world is different from yours, Rachel said gently. It's not just about teaching her to communicate. It's about meeting her where she is. It's about being present with her in ways that show her she's not alone. He nodded slowly, absorbing her words. I know you love her, Rachel added, but love isn't always enough. Sometimes love has to be spoken through actions, through patience, through trying to understand her even when it's hard. He looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. But how? Where do I even begin? Rachel hesitated for a moment before speaking. I think the best place to start is by learning sign language. It's the language she understands. It's a way to connect with her in her own world, a way to show her you're willing to try, to meet her on her level. The billionaire's eyes softened as he considered her suggestion. I'm willing to try, he said quietly. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Rachel smiled. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. And it will show Ava that you're there for her, that you see her, that she's not invisible. For the next hour, they discussed how they could begin. Rachel would help him learn the basics of sign language, teaching him simple words and phrases that would allow him to start connecting with his daughter. They agreed to meet regularly so he could practice, and Rachel would also be there to guide him along the way. When the meeting ended, the billionaire stood up and extended his hand. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with emotion. I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for the time I've lost, but I'll do my best. I'll make sure Ava knows she's not alone. Rachel shook his hand, feeling a sense of accomplishment. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she believed there was hope for Ava. She believed that her father might finally be ready to see her, not just as a silent child, but as the vibrant, creative soul she truly was. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and the billionaire worked together, slowly but surely making progress. Ava's father learned the basics of sign language, and with each lesson, Rachel could see him growing more confident, more comfortable in his efforts to communicate. One afternoon, as they sat together in his office, he signed a simple phrase, I love you. Rachel smiled, watching the sincerity in his eyes. She'll be so happy to hear that, she said softly. He looked at her, his expression filled with hope. I can't wait to tell her. As the lessons continued, Rachel could see the transformation happening. Ava's father was no longer a man consumed only by his work. He was a father who was finally willing to do the hard work of building a relationship with his daughter. And Ava, though still reserved, began to show small signs of hope. Her eyes sparkled when her father signed to her, and though the process was slow, the walls between them started to come down. The journey wasn't easy, and there were many challenges ahead. But in those quiet moments, as Rachel watched father and daughter begin to communicate in ways they never had before, she knew that things were changing. And it was in those small, beautiful changes that the real transformation had begun. Days turned into weeks, and the progress that had seemed slow at first began to pick up speed. Ava's father, the billionaire, had immersed himself in learning sign language, and with each passing day his efforts became more genuine, more confident. Rachel could see the change in him, not just in the way he signed to Ava, but in the way he looked at her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. It wasn't just about learning the language. It was about truly understanding who she was, what she needed, and how he could be there for her in a way he never had before. Rachel continued to meet with them regularly, helping the billionaire refine his skills, teaching him the subtleties of communication that went beyond the signs themselves. She taught him about body language, facial expressions, and the unspoken gestures that often conveyed more than words. Ava's world wasn't just silent. It was filled with a language of its own, one that didn't rely on sound but on touch, on movement, on the deep connection that could be made when people really saw each other. One afternoon, Rachel was sitting in the living room of the mansion with Ava and her father. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden light through the large windows. Ava was sitting on the floor drawing in her sketchbook, while her father sat beside her practicing his signs. The air in the room was calm, comfortable. There was a quietness, but it wasn't the kind of silence that made you feel alone. It was a peaceful kind of silence, the kind that comes from understanding, from knowing that the people around you are there for you, even when they don't speak the same language. Ava's father signed slowly, carefully, the words coming together more naturally now. "I want to hear you," he signed, looking at his daughter with a mixture of hope and vulnerability. Ava looked up at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. For a moment she didn't respond. It was as if she was weighing the sincerity of his words, trying to decide whether this was just another attempt that would fall short. But as she looked at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart swell. There was no doubt anymore. He wasn't just trying to learn sign language for the sake of learning. He was trying to understand her, to really connect with her. Ava signed back, her hands moving fluidly in the air. She didn't speak with her voice, but the way she signed spoke volumes. The words came out clearly, and her father's eyes lit up as he watched her hands move. "I am here," she signed. "You are here." The moment was simple yet profound. It wasn't just a conversation. It was a bridge between two worlds, one where words were heard and one where they were felt. Ava had finally found the words she had longed to share, and her father had found the patience to listen. In that moment, Rachel couldn't help but feel a lump form in her throat. This was what it was all about. This was what Ava had needed all along, not just to be loved, but to be understood. Over the next few months, things continued to improve. Ava's father grew more comfortable with sign language, and he began to integrate it into their daily lives. He would sign to her during breakfast, asking about her drawings or what she had planned for the day. He would sign simple phrases like "good morning" and "how are you?" As they shared quiet moments together, Ava responded with a smile, her face lighting up when her father signed to her, knowing that he was making an effort to understand her in ways he hadn't before. It wasn't just the language that had changed, though. Ava's father had also begun to spend more time with her, stepping away from his busy schedule to engage with her, to learn about her world. He started attending her art exhibitions where she displayed her drawings and paintings. At first, he had only visited because it was a social obligation, a way to show the world that he supported his daughter. But slowly, as he spent more time with her, he realized that it wasn't just about the art. It was about the way Ava expressed herself, about how her drawings gave her a voice, one that didn't rely on sound but on color and shape and form. One evening, after a particularly successful art exhibit where Ava had showcased her latest pieces, her father sat beside her as they looked at the paintings together. He signed, "I'm proud of you." Ava smiled, her eyes sparkling with warmth. She didn't need words to know that he meant it. She could see it in his eyes, feel it in the way he sat beside her, no longer distant, no longer an observer. He was there with her, sharing in her joy, her triumphs, and her dreams. Rachel watched this transformation from the sidelines, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't expected. She had never imagined that her small act of kindness at the gala, of sitting with Ava in a crowded room, would lead to this. She hadn't known that in helping Ava's father learn to sign, she would be helping them reconnect, helping them rediscover the bond that had always been there but had been lost in the noise of life. Ava's father, now more involved than ever, began to advocate for her in ways that he never had before. He pushed for more accessibility in schools, for more resources for children with disabilities, for more awareness about the challenges that people like Ava faced. He spoke at events and conferences, using his platform to share his journey, to tell people that learning to communicate with those who are different is not only important but necessary. But it wasn't just about advocating for others. It was about the way he had come to see Ava, not as a silent child who needed to be fixed, but as a bright, creative soul who had something to offer the world. He began to make sure that Ava's voice was heard, that her talents were acknowledged, and that she knew every day how deeply she was loved. One day, after a particularly moving conversation between them, where Ava had shared some of her dreams for the future, her father signed, "I will always be here for you, no matter what." Ava's eyes filled with emotion and she signed back, "I know." The simplicity of the exchange was everything. It wasn't just about the words or the signs. It was about the deep understanding that had formed between them. They no longer needed to speak the same language because they had learned to speak each other's hearts. As time went on, Ava blossomed. She grew more confident, more open, and she found her place in the world, not just as the billionaire's daughter, but as an artist, a storyteller, a person with a voice that deserved to be heard. Her father's love and support had given her the courage to chase her dreams, to show the world who she truly was. Rachel, too, had learned from this experience. She had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the biggest changes. She had learned that we all have something to offer, even if we don't speak the same language. And she had learned that love, when paired with understanding, could change the world. One day, as Rachel visited the family's home for a casual catch-up, she saw Ava and her father sitting together laughing as they signed back and forth. Ava's father was telling a joke, and Ava was responding with playful gestures that made them both laugh. It was a simple, ordinary moment, but to Rachel, it was a reminder of how far they had come. The billionaire had gone from a man who couldn't connect with his daughter to a father who was deeply involved in her life, who knew how to communicate with her, who saw her for who she was. And Ava, once a silent figure in a crowded room, had found her voice not just through words, but through the love and support of the people who cared about her. As Rachel watched them, she felt a sense of peace. This story wasn't just about the power of language or the importance of learning to communicate. It was about connection, about seeing someone for who they truly were, and about the incredible power of love and understanding. In that moment, Rachel knew that she had played a part in something beautiful, something that would last. Ava had found her voice, and her father had found his way back to her, and for Rachel that was enough. The journey that began with a simple gesture of kindness had led to a transformation that no one could have predicted. Rachel, Ava, and her father had all learned something about themselves, about each other, and about the power of connection. The changes they had experienced were not just about learning a new language, but about rediscovering what it meant to truly see one another. For Ava, life had taken on new meaning. She was no longer the quiet girl in the corner, hoping someone would notice her. She was an artist, a creator, and above all, she was someone who knew she was loved. Her art had always been her way of expressing herself, but now it was also a way for her to connect with others. Her paintings and drawings told stories, stories that spoke to the hearts of those who took the time to listen. Ava's father, too, had grown in ways he never expected. The once distant billionaire, wrapped up in the hustle of business and success, had become a different kind of man. He was no longer just a businessman. He was a father, a parent who was actively involved in his daughter's life. The lessons he had learned about communication, about patience, and about unconditional love had changed the way he saw the world. His relationship with Ava had deepened, and for the first time he truly felt like he understood her. Rachel, too, had been changed by her experiences. She had entered this story as someone who simply wanted to offer a little kindness to a child in need. But what she had found along the way was much more than that. She had found a family, a bond that was formed through shared experiences, challenges, and victories. Rachel had learned that small actions could have a ripple effect, that by showing up for someone, by taking the time to listen, you could change their life in ways you never imagined. As the months went on, the family continued to grow closer. Ava's art had started to gain attention, and her father was doing everything he could to help her succeed. He had used his resources to create opportunities for her, setting up art shows, supporting her in ways that were meaningful to her. But it wasn't just about the art. It was about the fact that he was there, actively involved, cheering her on every step of the way. One day, Rachel received an invitation to one of Ava's art shows. It was to be held in a local gallery, and Ava's father had spared no expense in making sure it was a special event. Rachel arrived at the gallery excited to see the progress Ava had made. The room was filled with people all admiring Ava's work. The walls were covered in paintings, each one a window into Ava's soul. There were vivid landscapes, delicate sketches of animals, and abstract representations of emotions that were both raw and beautiful. The gallery buzzed with conversation, but amid all the noise, Rachel felt a sense of calm when she saw Ava and her father together. Ava was standing beside one of her paintings, explaining it to a small group of people, using the signs Rachel had taught her. Her father stood next to her, signing along, supporting her every word. They were a team now, no longer two people separated by an invisible wall. Ava smiled as she spoke, her face lighting up with pride as she described the story behind each piece. It was clear to Rachel that Ava had not only found her voice through art, but through the support of her father, who had become her biggest advocate. Rachel made her way over to them, her heart swelling with happiness. Ava looked up and saw her approaching, a bright smile spreading across her face. She signed quickly, "Thank you for everything." Rachel reached out and gently hugged Ava, a gesture of gratitude and affection. "You did this," Rachel signed back. "You made it happen. I'm so proud of you." Ava's father, who had been quietly observing the exchange, spoke up. "Rachel, I can't express how grateful I am to you. Without you, I don't think I would have ever understood what I needed to do. You helped me find a way to reach her, to see her for who she truly is." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You did it. You're the one who changed. You're the one who stepped up. I'm just glad I could help." As the evening went on, Rachel watched Ava interact with the other guests. She wasn't shy anymore. She was confident, comfortable in her own skin, sharing her art and her thoughts with the world. Her father stood by her side, proud and supportive. He was no longer the man who had been lost in his business empire, too focused on work to see the person sitting right in front of him. He was now the man who had learned what it meant to truly be present for his daughter, to put her needs first, and to love her in the way she had always needed. The show was a success, and as the crowd began to disperse, Ava's father pulled Rachel aside. "I know I'll never be able to thank you enough for what you've done for us," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "You gave me the chance to connect with my daughter in a way that I never thought was possible." Rachel felt a lump form in her throat, but she smiled, trying to keep the emotion in check. "I'm just glad I could be a part of this journey," she said softly. "You two are incredible. The bond you share is beautiful." As they walked out of the gallery together, Ava and her father continued to talk excitedly about the show, and Rachel couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. She had done what she set out to do. She had helped them find their way back to each other. But in the process, she had gained something too. She had learned the true meaning of connection, of love, and of being present for someone no matter the circumstances. Ava's father had finally understood what his daughter had always needed. It wasn't about providing her with material things or building a legacy. It was about being there for her in the moments that mattered. It was about showing up even when it was hard, and learning to communicate in ways that made her feel seen and heard. For Ava, this was just the beginning. She had a bright future ahead of her, full of opportunities and possibilities. Her art would continue to grow, and her father would continue to support her every step of the way. But more importantly, she had found her place in the world. She had found people who truly cared about her, who saw her for who she was, and who were willing to do whatever it took to help her succeed. And for Rachel, this was the kind of story that reminded her of the power of simple acts of kindness. It wasn't about grand gestures or flashy accomplishments. It was about showing up, being there for someone and taking the time to listen and understand. It was about creating connections that lasted a lifetime. As Rachel looked at Ava and her father walking together, sharing a quiet moment, she knew that this was the beginning of something beautiful. The journey they had started together was far from over, but one thing was certain: they were no longer invisible. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found the strength to face whatever the future held.